The morning Clifford Arsenault showed up at CFB Borden's long-range precision course with the Lee-Enfield No. 4 MKI, three of the younger instructors actually laughed. Not behind his back, to his face. Kevin Drost, who ran the marksmanship program out of Petawawa and considered himself something of an authority on the subject, walked over and looked at the rifle, the way a man looks at a car with a flat tire on the highway, with pity and a touch of embarrassment for the owner. The rifle was old. Not vintage old in the collector's sense, work old. The stock was the colour of used motor oil, worn smooth at the grip and along the forestock where decades of hands had rested. The bluing on the barrel had gone to grey at the muzzle. The rear aperture sight, adjusted by hand, had no illumination, no magnification, no adjustment dial with satisfying clicks. It was the kind of equipment you found in the back of a Legion Hall closet under a folded flag and a box of old photographs. Drost had spent $4,000 on his rifle, not including the scope. 500 metres, he said to the man standing beside him, a reservist from London named Gareth McLean, nodding toward Arsenault. That's the distance on this course today, 500 metres, with iron sights. McLean watched the old man set up at the firing line, unhurried, taking his time unfolding a worn canvas mat and lowering himself onto it with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees had opinions about the matter. He knows that, right? He signed the same waiver we did. Neither of them said anything further. They didn't need to. Clifford Arsenault was 73 years old. He had a hearing aid in his left ear that he'd bought at a pharmacy in Brockville and a pair of bifocals hanging from the collar of his flannel shirt. He drove a 1998 Silverado with 190,000 kilometers on it, and a crack in the dashboard that had been there so long he no longer saw it. He lived alone on 7 acres outside of Smiths Falls, raised a small vegetable garden, kept 2 cats named after hockey players, and attended the Thursday evening coffee hour at the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 95, with a consistency that the other regulars had come to regard as something close to a public service. He had not told anyone at the range that morning what he used to do for a living. He never told anyone that. He had registered for the CFB Borden Open from Precision the same way he registered for everything, quietly, by mail, with a cheque that cleared without fuss. The course was open to veterans and active personnel and was meant to be a skills assessment and a refresher for reservists. Most of the participants were younger, much younger. Some of them had equipment that Arsenault genuinely could not name, scopes with turrets and reticles and illuminated dots that he'd never seen the inside of a manual for. There was a woman from the Brockville Rifles who had driven up in a truck with a rifle case that looked like it belonged on a film set, hard-sided and foam-lined, and carried with the reverence of something breakable. There was a retired warrant officer from Kingston who wore a shooting jacket with so many patches on it that it was difficult to determine the original colour of the fabric. They were good people, most of them, skilled, serious, and proud of it. They just didn't know what to make of the old man with the Lee-Enfield. The range that morning was set up for a 5-stage precision course. Targets at 100 metres, 200, 300, 400 and 500. The final stage, the 500-metre target, was where the morning would be decided. It was the longest stage Borden had run in 3 years. The chief range officer, a major named Stephen Carlaw, had briefed the group before they took their positions and had noted, without particular ceremony, that performance at 500 metres with iron sights would be considered exceptional by any standard. He had said as an aside, not really directed at anyone, but several people had glanced in Arsenault's direction when he said it. Arsenault had not noticed. He was looking at the range. The thing you have to understand about Clifford Arsenault, and almost no one at Borden that morning understood it, was that he had done this before. Not in the recreational sense. Not in the competition sense. He had done it in the way that becomes part of the body's memory. The kind of knowledge that doesn't live in the mind so much as in the hands and the breath, and the place behind the sternum where the heartbeat steadies when it needs to. He had been trained by men who had been trained by men who had come home from Europe with mud still in the seams of their boots. He had practiced on ranges in weather that made the Borden morning look like a June afternoon in the Muskokas. He had fired in conditions that he was not permitted to describe in any detail, in places whose names he was not supposed to mention, at distances that were, even now, classified. He had not fired competitively in 11 years. He had brought the Lee-Enfield because it was what he had. It was what he had always had. He'd been issued one in 1969 at a training course in Gagetown that had lasted 8 months and had removed something fundamental from his understanding of what a human body was capable of enduring. He had fired that specific pattern of rifle, the No. 4 MKI, with its aperture rear sight and its 10-round magazine for the better part of 4 decades. He knew it the way a carpenter knows a particular hammer. The weight of it, the way the trigger broke, the precise amount of breath to release before the shot. He was not nervous standing at the line. He was, if anything, slightly bored. The first stage passed without incident. At 100 meters, every shooter on the line hit their target. The scores were clustered close together. Drost shot a tight group slightly left of center and made a small adjustment to his scope with a tool he kept on a lanyard around his neck. Maclean shot well. The woman from the Brockville Rifles shot exceptionally well and didn't react at all when she saw her score, which told Arsenault she'd expected it. At 100 meters, the Lee-Enfield was the least interesting thing on the range. 200 meters. Still comfortable for most. The groups opened up a little. 1 or 2 shooters struggled with the crosswind that had come up from the east, pushing maybe 8 or 10 kilometers an hour. Arsenault felt it against his left cheek and adjusted without thinking about it, the way you adjust your stride on ice. 300 meters. Here the field began to separate. Drost was shooting well. The woman from Brockville was still shooting exceptionally. A younger man from the 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, whose name Arsenault hadn't caught, had a rough stage and reset his position 3 times before his final shot. Arsenault put 5 rounds into a group that Carlaw measured afterward and did not immediately comment on. Drost watched from 2 positions down and said nothing, but he stopped talking to Maclean. 400 meters. The crosswind had stiffened. 2 shooters withdrew from the final stage rather than embarrass themselves. One of them made a joke about his eyes, which got a polite laugh. Arsenault took his time on the mat, feeling the wind on his face, watching the grass at the 500-meter berm for movement. He shot the 400-meter stage with the same economy of motion he had used at every other distance, and his group was the smallest on the line, and he stood up from the mat and folded it and waited for the 500-meter stage without expression. It was Drost who said it, not quietly. "You understand the aperture on that thing's not adjustable for wind, right? You're going to be holding off with no reference point. At 500 meters, that crosswind's going to push you off target by." He paused and did the math in his head visibly, at least a meter, maybe more. Arsenault looked at him. He had pale eyes, the washed-out blue of old denim, and they did not change when Drost spoke. "I know," he said. "I'm just saying, with a scope you dial for it. You've got a mechanism. With iron sights—" "I know," Arsenault said again. Drost opened his mouth, closed it, and walked back to his position. The 500-meter stage began. What happened next is difficult to describe accurately, because the people who witnessed it have, in the years since, disagreed about certain details. Maclean, who wrote about it afterward in a letter to his father, described it as watching someone perform a surgical procedure in a moving vehicle. The woman from the Brockville Rifles, whose name was Sergeant Heather Colquhoun, said it reminded her of her grandfather playing piano. Not the music, but the quality of the attention, the way the hands moved without consulting the mind. The young man from 3RCR said he didn't really understand what he was seeing until it was over. What they agreed on was this. Clifford Arsenault lay down on his mat. He adjusted his sling with 2 precise movements, wrapping it around his left arm in the way that had been standard practice for the better part of a century, a technique that distributed the rifle's weight through the bone rather than the muscle and reduced movement by a degree that was invisible to the naked eye but significant on paper. He settled into the rifle. He did not rush. He did not appear to think. He was looking downrange at something 500 meters away that the other shooters could see only through their scopes, and he was looking at it with bare eyes, with bifocals hanging from his collar, and his face was the face of a man reading a familiar page. He fired 5 rounds. The wind pushed. It was gusting now, irregular, the worst kind, the kind you couldn't dial for and couldn't fully predict. Between the 3rd and 4th shots, a gust came through hard enough to shift the target slightly on its post, and the range officer noted it and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Arsenault fired his 4th round and his 5th round and stood up from the mat. Nobody spoke. Carlaw, the range officer, walked down range with his clipboard. He had been running precision courses at Borden for 11 years. He had seen good shooting. He had seen remarkable shooting, once or twice, the kind that made you stop and double-check your measurement, because the alternative was that something happened that you didn't have a clean explanation for. He measured Arsenault's group. He measured it again. He walked back to the firing line slowly, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at the same answer twice. He had been a military man for 26 years. He knew restraint. He was not given to dramatics. He stopped in front of Clifford Arsenault and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, so that only the people near the front of the line could hear, "Who are you?" It was not a rude question. It was the kind of question that contains an accusation only if you're guilty of something. Arsenault wasn't guilty of anything. He just stood there with the Lee-Enfield hanging from his right hand and looked at Carlo with those pale, patient eyes. "Clifford Arsenault," he said. "I'm a member at Branch 95, Smith's Falls." Carlo stared at him. "Are you?" he said. It was not a question. He turned and looked at the score sheet in his clipboard. He looked at it the way you look at a document when you're trying to find the error. And then he looked back at Arsenault and he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be straight with me. Were you ever at Gagetown around 1969? The old man's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted the way a door shifts when a latch catches. "I was," he said. Carlo nodded, slowly, the way people nod when a thing they suspected turns out to be true. He looked down at the clipboard again. Then he held out his hand. "Major Stephen Carlo," he said. "My father was an instructor at Gagetown from 68 to 72. He used to talk about a shooter from the long-range course. Said he'd never in his life seen a man hold off a wind correction by feel like that. Said it was like watching someone catch a ball he hadn't seen thrown." He paused. "Arsenault." He used to say the name when he talked about it. The old man shook Carlo's hand. He didn't say anything. There was nothing particular to say. Drost had stopped cleaning his scope. McLean had stopped moving entirely. Colquhoun from the Brockville Rifles was standing very still with her arms at her sides, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has just realized they've been looking at a painting without understanding what it was a painting of. Carlo said, still holding the clipboard, "Would you be willing to speak to the group about technique, about the wind hold, about—" "No," Arsenault said, not unkindly. "Thank you, Major." He folded his mat. He set the Lee-Enfield in its case, the old canvas case, with the shoulder strap that had been repaired at some point with a strip of bootlace and had never been replaced because it still worked. He zipped the case. He picked it up. He nodded to Carlo and to Colquhoun and to no one in particular, and he walked to his truck. Drost watched him go. He stood there with his $4,000 rifle and its turret-adjusted scope and its illuminated reticle, and he watched a 73-year-old man put a Lee-Enfield in the bed of a Silverado and drive away on a gravel road, and he did not say anything for a long time. McLean said, eventually, "I feel like I missed something." "We all missed something," Drost said. Nobody quite knew then the full shape of what they had missed. The name Clifford Arsenault meant nothing to most of them. It would not mean anything for some time. What they could not have known, standing at that firing line, was what Arsenault had done with that kind of stillness before. Not at competitions, not at courses. The record of it existed in documents that required clearance to read, in a file at a building in Ottawa that most people in that country did not know the address of. The specifics are not mine to share. What is mine to share is this: there had been a winter, in a decade that is now far enough behind us to feel like a different country, when a situation had developed in a way that situations are not supposed to develop, and the resolution of it had required one person, in one position, to wait for a very long time in conditions that were considered, afterward by the people who reviewed the file, to be incompatible with the outcome that had been achieved. One of those people, a senior officer who had been reviewing such files for 30 years, had written a single line in the margin of the assessment. He had written, "How?" It was not a question that ever received an official answer. The man who could have answered it drove home to Smith's Falls that afternoon and fed the cats and heated up a bowl of soup and sat at the kitchen table reading a library book about the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, because he had always found infrastructure interesting, and the light was good in the kitchen in the late afternoon, and there was no reason not to. He lived for another 4 years after the day at Borden. He died on a Tuesday in November at the hospital in Smith's Falls In the early morning hours when the hallways are quiet and the parking lot is nearly empty and the sky outside the window is the particular dark that comes just before the dark starts to give up. His daughter, Pauline, was with him. She had driven from Guelph when the call came and had been there for 2 days, sleeping in the chair by the bed, and she was awake when he went. There was no dramatic moment. There was no last word that she could make out clearly. There was the sound of his breathing, and then there was not, and the difference between the two was so gentle that she was not certain, at first, which side of it she was on. The funeral was held at the Legion, Branch 95, because that was where he had asked for it to be held, in the straightforward and unapologetic way he had asked for most things in the last year when he still had the energy to be particular about arrangements. It was a Thursday. The Thursday regulars came, all of them, without anyone having to call. They came in their good coats and their branch pins and their faces that had been worn down to something honest by years of coffee and company, and the particular comfort of sitting with people who understood certain things without having to say them. Major Carlaw came. He drove 4 hours from Borden in a rental car because his own vehicle was being serviced, and he sat in the second row with his hands folded and his uniform pressed, and he did not speak until it was time to speak, and then he spoke carefully and with precision, which is what he had learned from men who had learned it from other men, in a chain that stretched back further than any of them would ever fully trace. He spoke about the day at the range. He described the crosswind and the 500-meter target and the group that he had measured twice. He said that in 26 years of military service, he had met a small number of people who had achieved something that could not be accounted for entirely by training or by talent alone, something that required an additional quality for which the language of the institution did not have a precise word. He said Clifford Arsenault had been one of those people. He said he had driven 4 hours to say so, and he would drive 4 hours back, and he did not consider it an inconvenience. Pauline spoke. She talked about her father's garden and his cats, Lafleur and Sittler, because he had been a Habs man who nonetheless had enormous respect for Hitler, which she said was the most complex thing she had ever understood about him. She talked about the drives they had taken on Sunday mornings along the Rideau when she was small, stopping at every lock, her father knowing the history of each one in the way that some people know the history of battles. She said he had never talked about his work. Not once. Not in any form. She had known he was a veteran. She had known there was a file somewhere, in a building she had never been to, that contained some account of what he had done. She had never tried to read it, she said. He used to say that the things you're most proud of are usually the things you can say the least about. She paused. I used to think that was just something he said. Now I think it was the most accurate thing he ever told me. There was a reception afterward in the Legion's main hall, with coffee and sandwiches and a table of photographs that Pauline had put together from the box she'd found in her father's closet after he passed. Most of the photographs were of landscapes, the garden, the truck, a dog he had owned in the 90s whose name nobody in the room could remember. There were very few photographs of Arsenault himself, and in the ones that existed, he was almost always looking at something other than the camera, off to the side. Downrange, you might say. Drost was not at the funeral. He did not know at that point that Arsenault had died, because he had not known, in any meaningful way, who Arsenault had been. That came later, and when it came the way these things tend to come, through someone who knew someone, through a conversation that started about something else, through the specific embarrassment of realizing that you had laughed at a thing you had not understood. He has not, since that day at Borden, made a comment to an old man at a firing line about his equipment. He has not needed to be told why. Colhan, the sergeant from the Brockville Rifles, went back to Borden twice after Arsenault died, once for a training course, and once for no official reason she could articulate clearly when her commanding officer asked. She stood at the 500-meter line on a November afternoon, with the same crosswind coming from the same eastern quarter, and she looked through her scope at the target, and she thought about what it meant to hold off by feel, without a reference point, without a mechanism, without anything to rely on except the accumulated knowledge of your own hands, and how long it would take a person to build that, and what it would have cost. She did not have an answer. She still doesn't. What she does have is a different way of looking at the people who show up at a firing line with old equipment and say nothing about themselves. In the Legion Hall in Smiths Falls, at the Thursday evening coffee hour, the chair that Clifford Arsenault had occupied for 11 years is still the same chair. Nobody took it in a formal way. It just happened, gradually, without a policy being stated or a sign being placed, that the chair remained open on Thursday evenings, and the men and women who came for coffee arranged themselves around it and talked about the things they talked about. Hockey, weather, the state of the highway between Smiths Falls and Brockville, the latest news from the grandchildren, and did not remark on it. Some things do not require a remark. Some things you simply make room for. That is something he would have understood. This country understood long before it could put it into words, that there are people who stand in the gap between what we are and what comes after, and they do it without a flag and without a speech, and sometimes without anyone noticing at all, until the day you measure their work and find that the group is tighter than it should be, that the wind was accounted for with no mechanism to account for it, and you realize, standing there with your clipboard in both hands, that you are looking at the evidence of a life lived with a precision that belongs to a different register altogether. He never told anyone what he had done. He never needed to.